Welcome to Revolution Chronicles. If you enjoy powerful stories from America's haunting past, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a tale. Now, let's step back in time into the shadow of the Grayson homestead, where silence and mystery turned 22 families to dust. The land out past the old county line had always carried whispers, the kind of whispers folks never spoke of in daylight, but shared only in hushed voices on the porch after the lamps had been turned low. They spoke of the Grayson place, a homestead older than most of the towns that now surrounded it, a wide stretch of earth. First, cut and claimed when the nation was still young and rough, the Graysons had come west in the 1820s. Carrying little more than a wagon pulled by a pair of half-starved mules, their children wrapped in quilts, their faces drawn but determined. They carved a place for themselves from a world that seemed determined to beat them back, clearing fields by hand-setting timbers against the endless prairie winds and raising a barn that would stand longer than they themselves ever could. That barn stood tall, not with beauty, but with a kind of grim stubbornness. Its timbers were heavy oak dragged by oxen from deep in the forest, its nails forged one by one in the smoke of a blackened forge. It was built to last, and in that time when nothing was certain, that barn was a promise to themselves and to the land that they would endure generations. Worked under its beams, storing their harvests, mending their tools, bringing in their animals at night, it was said that even in the worst storms, when lightning struck the hills and rain drove like knives against the soil, the barn never trembled, never groaned, never gave way. It became the heart of the Grayson farm, a shadowed cathedral of labor where sweat and hope mixed in the air with the smell of hay and soil. But behind its endurance, there was something else, something people only began to notice years later, when the edges of the Grayson story started to fray. The Grayson family grew in number, their children marrying other farm folk, until the homestead became a settlement of its own, a cluster of cabins and shacks all leaning close to that great barn. And in time, it wasn't only the Graysons who lived there, but families drawn by hard times who came seeking work, food, or a place to belong. The barn was where they gathered, where they stored not only their grain and seed, but sometimes their very lives, for in winters when cabins grew too cold and winds cut too sharp, people would move their bedding up into the loft, where it was warm and dry. They said that in those winters you could hear laughter echoing from the rafters, the sound of children playing while snow swallowed the world outside. Yet something about that laughter always seemed to fade too quickly. Perhaps it was the air in that barn, heavy and strange. Perhaps it was the way shadows lingered too long on the walls. No one could ever say for certain, but stories began to ripple through the countryside of sickness that came without warning. Families strong and healthy, one week struck down the next with weakness and fever, their skin paling, their voices thinning to whispers. Neighbors who went to check on them would find cabins silent and fires dead embers. Yet the families were not in their beds, they were always in the barn, and when they were found, they looked not like the dying, but like the dead, sealed in a stillness that felt older than the land itself, their faces hollow, their skin drawn tight yet not rotting, not crumbling. Instead, they looked preserved, caught in some terrible sleep, as if the barn itself had claimed them. At first, the county doctor tried to explain it. He said it must have been the damp, the poor air, the rot of hay, or some illness hidden in the soil. But his words could not explain why their bodies never decayed, why when laid to rest, they seemed almost as whole as the day they had been found. And so the whispers grew louder. Some said the barn was cursed. Others said the Graysons had built it on ground that was not theirs, stolen ground that had never wanted them from the start. There were even older voices that claimed the land itself was angry that the earth beneath the barn was holding something it meant never to release. By the time the Civil War tore through the nation, the Grayson homestead was already wrapped in mystery. Men went off to fight, sons of farmers and ranchers alike, but when they came home, some did not go back to their own land. They stayed on with the Graysons for reasons they could never quite name. Drawn perhaps by the promise of safety, or maybe by something darker. By then, it was known throughout the county that whole families had disappeared into that barn, and when word spread that their bodies had been found dry and lifeless, yet untouched by time, people began to avoid the road that passed nearest. The Grayson farm travelers would go miles out of their way to keep from seeing the silhouette of that barn standing black against the horizon, but not everyone avoided it. There were those who came seeking answers, preachers who claimed they could cast out whatever evil lived in the wood, and stone men of science who thought they could solve the riddle with measurements and notebooks. They all left unsettled. More confused than before, the preachers said their prayers fell dead in the air, swallowed before they reached the rafters. The men of science said the barn seemed to breathe, its timbers holding moisture when the land around it cracked with drought, its air dry even when storms rolled through and left the fields soaked. No matter how they measured or prayed, the truth stood unchanged. Families went into that barn, and some of them never came out again, at least not alive. Still, the Graysons endured. They were not untouched by tragedy. They buried their own, yet they held to their land with a grip that seemed as unyielding as the oak beams of their barn. Some whispered that they had struck a bargain with whatever force ruled that place, that their own would be spared, so long as others paid the price. But the truth was not so simple, for Grayson's sons and daughters were found among the dead as often as strangers. It seemed that the barn chose without pattern, without mercy. By the time the century turned, the Grayson homestead was no longer just a farm. It was a shadow that stretched across the county. Even those who had never seen the barn could describe it, tall and black against the sky, its doors yawning open like a mouth waiting to swallow whatever stepped too close. Stories spread like wildfire, told at fairs, around campfires, and in schoolhouses, until the barn was no longer just a building, but a legend. And, like all legends, it carried a weight of both fear and fascination. Some dared each other to touch its doors. Some swore they heard voices in the night carried on the wind from its rafters. And always there was the count, the grim tally whispered among neighbors like a prayer. 22 families, whole and entire, gone into that barn and found mummified, as though time itself had turned its gaze away from them. It was no longer a question of accident or sickness. The people knew something unnatural lived in that place. They said the barn kept what it was given, sealing it away, not in rot but in silence, as if it was building a collection of the lost. The Graysons never spoke of it. Not to neighbors, not to strangers. When asked, they turned their eyes to the ground there. Silence heavier than words, and so the mystery deepened. The barn standing year after year as the world around it changed roads, paved telegraph lines, strung towns growing into cities. Yet the Grayson barn stood unchanged, holding its dark secret behind walls of oak and shadow. And it is there that the heart of this story lies, not only in the families who turned to dust, but in the way the land itself seemed to resist forgetting. For even as the years passed, even as children who once whispered about the Graysons grew into old men and women, the story was told again and again. The barn of the Grayson homestead, where 22 families found not death as we know it, but something colder, something quieter, a silence that held them in its grasp long after their voices were gone. The Grayson barn did not change its face as the decades rolled on. The same weathered planks, the same gaping doors, the same loft windows staring out over the land like the empty eyes of some giant skull. Generations were born beneath its shadow, and generations died, yet the barn remained as though time had no claim over it. People began to say that the barn was older than it had any right to be, that even as storms rotted fences and lightning split trees, the barn stood as though carved, not by human hands, but by something greater and darker. When men leaned against its timbers, they said they could feel a hum deep in the grain, a kind of pulse, not unlike the faint throb of a living vein. The strange deaths continued, not in a rush, but in slow, steady beats, like the tolling of a bell. Families would come to stay at the homestead for a season or two. Field workers, schoolteachers, drifters who thought they had found a safe roof above their heads and a place among the Graysons. Some would leave as normal, taking the dirt roads back to town, but others did not. And always, when they were found, it was in the barn. The bodies discovered were dry light as husks their skin, clinging to bone as though the life had been drawn out. Of them yet, their clothes, their hair, even the expressions on their faces remained as though carved into stone. They were not skeletons, they were statues of themselves frozen in a last terrible moment of breath by the 1880s newspapers had begun to whisper of it, their pages filled with tales of strange happenings on the prairie. One headline read, "The Silent Barn of Clayton County," another called it, "The Tomb of the Living," and though few reporters dared to go themselves, they gathered the stories from travelers and neighbors until the Grayson barn was a legend, not just in its county, but across the state. Curious men came, then writers, artists, men who believed they could peel back the curtain of the strange and explain it with reason. In ink they walked through the barn by lamplight, sketching the beams, the lofts, the dust that hung heavy in the air. Like fog, they asked questions of the Graysons, who gave no answers, only silence and a kind of cold patience that unsettled even the boldest visitor. Some of these men wrote that the barn was a trick of the earth, a place where some odd mixture of soil and air drained the very moisture from the body. Others said it was the work of chemicals, perhaps, in the wood of the barn itself, but none of their words explained why the bodies never rotted, why they seemed to rest in a kind of peace that was worse than any violence could have been. It was a peace without choice, a silence that went on and on. The county sheriff tried once to put an end to it. He gathered men with axes and torches, determined to tear the barn down, to burn it to ash and scatter the beams so that no one would ever see its shadow again. The men gathered at dusk, their faces stern, their voices low. But when they came within sight of the barn, something in them faltered. The sheriff urged them forward, but one by one they stopped their steps. Slowing, their eyes fixed on the yawning black of the doorway, he cursed them, called them cowards, but even he could not move nearer. They said later that the air around the barn was too heavy to breathe, that the closer they came, the more the world seemed to bend, as though the ground itself wanted to swallow them. Not one axe was raised that night, not one torch lit. The sheriff left in shame, his badge handed over weeks later to a man who never once mentioned the Grayson homestead, and so the barn remained untouchable. Not by law, not by neighbor, not by time. It stood through storms that flattened towns, through winters that turned rivers to glass, through summers when the ground cracked open and cattle died in the fields. It stood when the railroad came and carried men westward past its lonely silhouette, and it stood when electricity reached the nearby towns, lighting streets with a glow that never touched its weathered boards. The barn remained outside of time, untouched and unbroken by the turn of the century. The Grayson name was known far beyond the county. Their farm no longer thrived, the soil thin and dry, but the story of their barn lived on in dime novels and whispered tales told by traveling salesmen in hotel parlors. The number was always the same: 22 families lost to the barn, their bodies preserved as though claimed by some jealous hand that refused to let them return to dust. Some said the number could not be true, that surely stories had stretched the truth, but those who had walked the rafters, those who had seen the figures lying still in the straw, swore the count was real. They spoke of men and women curled together as if they had lain down for sleep, children held tight in their mothers' arms, their faces serene, but too still, too quiet. There were nights when young folk from town dared each other to ride out to the homestead. They would creep through the tall grass, their lanterns flickering, their laughter breaking into nervous whispers as the dark bulk of the barn rose before them. Some would push the doors open just enough to slip inside, and there, they said, the air was colder, heavier, as though it pressed against their skin. They claimed they could hear the faint rustle of hay when no one moved, the faint sigh of breath when no chest rose or fell. Some said they saw eyes glimmering in the rafters, not of men, but of something older, watching, waiting. No one ever stayed long inside the barn, not even the boldest of them. They always fled back to town, pale-faced, their voices trembling even as they laughed and tried to shake it off. The Graysons themselves had grown fewer by then. The family that once filled cabins and shacks was now scattered, thinned by sickness, by war, by the quiet toll of time. A few remained to tend the land, stubborn and silent as their fathers had been. They worked the soil, though it gave little. They mended fences, though cattle no longer grazed the pastures they kept. The barn standing, though no harvest filled it. The barn had become not just their burden, but their identity. The Graysons were the keepers of the dark place, the guardians of something no one else wanted to claim. And though their faces were lined and weary, though their shoulders bent beneath the years, they never left, not once. Not for all the fear and whispers that clung to their name. As the years passed, the land around the homestead changed. Towns grew into cities. The sound of automobiles replaced the creak of wagons. Yet the Grayson barn remained like a wound that would not heal in time. The land grew wild around it, fields swallowed by weeds, fences broken and left to lean, but the barn still stood. Travelers passing on new paved roads would see it from afar, its silhouette sharp against the horizon, and feel a chill, though they could not say why. They would quicken their horses, quicken their engines, unwilling to linger in its shadow. But not all who passed kept their distance. Some still came, drawn by curiosity, by fear, by the strange pull of a story that refused to die. They carried cameras, now the Proso, the new machines that captured light on glass. They thought perhaps to prove something, to capture the truth of the barn in images they could show to others. They came away with photographs, dark and blurred, the shape of the barn looming sharp, but the inside always lost to shadow. In some frames, faint outlines appeared, faces pressed against the darkness, expressions hollow and pale. When they showed these pictures in town, some swore the figures were nothing but tricks of light. Others whispered they were the dead themselves, peering out from the gloom. Barn grew to be more than a story. It was a warning. It was the shadow side of all the hope that had built the nation. Families had come west with dreams of soil and sky, but at the Grayson homestead, 22 of them had found only silence and dust. It was a reminder that the land did not always yield, that the frontier held secrets it would never surrender. And as the 20th century marched on into its bright new age, the Grayson barn stood behind like a relic, like a monument to the truth that some parts of the past would never be tamed. The Grayson barn did not fade from memory, even as the world beyond it spun forward into new inventions and modern life. Radios carried voices across the plains, voices that spoke of cities and wonders, of electricity and machines that could fly. But for the people of Clayton County, there was always the barn on the horizon, a reminder that no matter how far mankind reached into the sky, the earth itself still carried secrets that could not be explained. The Grayson place had become more than a farm. It was a landmark of dread, a destination for those who craved the taste of fear, and for those who wanted proof that history could cling to a place so tightly it would never loosen its grip. By the 1920s, the barn was already something of a ruin from the outside, its planks weathered, its roof sagging in places, the wind whistling through gaps between boards. Yet still it stood. Still it refused to crumble. And when storms rolled through and tore shingles from houses in town, the barn remained. The Graysons who lived nearest were now old men and women, their faces carved with deep lines, their voices rough with years they rarely went into town, and when they did, they spoke little. Some claimed the Graysons had long since stopped farming altogether, that they survived on what little the land gave them and what they could trade with passing travelers. Others whispered that they no longer needed food in the way ordinary folk did, that the barn itself sustained them with its terrible power. Curiosity only grew with the years. Reporters came with cameras and notebooks, their city shoes sinking in the mud. As they walked up the old road to the homestead, they wrote articles filled with words like macabre and unnatural, describing the barn as a place where history had stopped, where time itself had betrayed those who lived within its shadow. They tried to speak to the Graysons, but were met with silence or with doors closed in their faces, the only words ever spoken Were warnings soft and weary? Don't go into the barn. Don't open the doors. Don't look too long at what waits inside. The reporters wrote these words down, but often with a kind of mocking tone, as though the old farmers were nothing more than relics of a superstitious past. But when some of those same men stepped inside, they did not laugh for long. The photographs they carried back were always the same. The outlines of bodies lying where they had fallen long ago, preserved in an impossible stillness, men curled around wives, children pressed against their mothers' chests, old men with hands folded as if in prayer, each face dry and tight with a stillness that seemed both peaceful and horrifying. No rot, no stench, no crumbling of flesh into dust, only a silence that pressed against the air like a weight. Some of those reporters wrote what they saw and never came back to the county again. Others kept silent, refusing to explain why their eyes seemed hollowed by fear. The number 20. 2 was whispered louder then, for it was no longer just a tale passed by neighbors. It was printed on paper. It was spoken on radios, the story of a barn that had claimed whole families without decay. People came from across the country, drawn not only by horror, but by fascination. The barn became a kind of pilgrimage site. Though few dared to step inside, families would drive out in their new automobiles, park at the edge of the field, and stare at the looming structure in the fading light. Some would tell their children the story, some would whisper prayers. Some would laugh nervously, honk their horns, and drive away too fast, as though chased by something unseen. There were attempts again to destroy it. Men came with chains and machines. Iron teeth meant to tear the structure down piece by piece, but each attempt ended the same. The chains broke, the machines failed, men swore they saw shadows move across the beams. Though no wind stirred within the barn, one man fell dead of a heart attack before he could even set foot inside, and after that, no crew would take the job. The barn was untouchable, as it had always been, untouchable. Not by storm, not by fire, not by man. The years marched on, and the Grayson family dwindled, until only a handful remained, their children left for the cities. Some changed their names to escape the weight of their history, but always a few stayed as if bound to the land by something stronger than blood. They became recluses, their windows dark, their gates closed. They spoke to no one but each other, and in time, their faces became just as much a part of the legend as the barn itself. Pale, sharp-eyed figures who moved like ghosts through the fields. Some said they were keepers, some said they were prisoners bound to a duty they had never asked for. By the 1950s, the county had grown busy towns, expanding highways, paved, cutting closer and closer to the old homestead. Yet still, no one bought the land, no one moved near it. Developers came with plans, but their surveys always stopped short of the Grayson fields. Some said the soil was too poor for building, others admitted the truth aloud. They simply wanted no part of the place. The barn cast too long a shadow, its story too heavy, even in an age of progress when men split atoms and flew across oceans. The story of the Grayson barn could still bring a chill to those who spoke it. But memory is a strange thing, and even fear can grow quiet with time. By the 1970s, there were children in Clayton County who no longer knew the story, who drove past the old barn without more than a glance. Some thought it was nothing but a ruin, something that should have been torn down long ago. They laughed at the old tales, dismissing them as ghost stories from another age. It was only when those same children dared each other to step inside that the truth of the barn returned with all its weight. They found what their grandparents had spoken of: bodies preserved in impossible stillness, whole families gathered as if in sleep, 22 in all, no more, no less, untouched by the years, as though the barn itself refused to release them. Word spread again, renewed and heavy. The barn was no ruin. It was a tomb that still held its dead untouched. Even after more than a century, scientists came then with machines and gloves and careful words. They studied the bodies under the dim light of the barn, measuring, weighing, testing. They spoke of air currents, of chemical reactions, of unique soil and would, but when pressed, none could explain why flesh had not turned to dust, why faces still held the shape of expression, why children looked as though they might stir at any moment and open their eyes. One scientist left his instruments behind. Refusing to step foot near the barn again, he told a reporter later in a shaking voice, "Some places do not want to be understood." The barn became a legend once more, a place spoken of in documentaries and hushed radio programs. Late at night it was compared to pyramids, to catacombs, to ancient tombs where bodies remained long after their time. But this was not Egypt, not Rome. This was America, and it was not kings or priests preserved in the dark, but ordinary families, mothers, fathers, children, who had come seeking life and found only silence. It was this that struck deepest in the hearts of those who heard the story, that it was not the mighty preserved for glory, but the humble kept against their will, held by something no one could name by. The close of the 20th century, the Grayson family line had thinned to almost nothing. A few scattered descendants lived in nearby towns, but they did not speak their name. They did not acknowledge the barn. Some said the last true Grayson had died in the farmhouse, with no one beside him but the whisper of the wind against the walls. After that, the homestead was left empty, the fields wild, the barn standing alone, more silent than ever before. Yet even then, it did not crumble. It stood tall against the horizon, its shadow stretching over the land as it always had, waiting. And so the story of the 22 families grew into something more than a tale of death. It became a reminder, etched into the land itself, of the fragility of life, of the mysteries that no man could command. The barn remained as a monument, not of triumph, not of progress, but of silence, a silence that clung to the boards and beams, and to the very earth on which it stood. And though generations passed, though well-moshed past, though the world outside changed beyond recognition, the Grayson barn stood still, holding its terrible secret with a patience deeper than time itself. By the time the new century dawned, the Grayson barn no longer belonged to a family. It belonged to the land itself. The farmhouse was empty, its windows broken, its roof sagging. The fences had collapsed into the weeds, and the fields that once rang with the sound of plows and cattle now lay silent, with only the cry of crows circling above. But the barn still stood proud and solemn, its frame unbroken, its doors yawning wide, as though still waiting, still guarding, still keeping. The homestead had become a place that few visited willingly, yet it was never forgotten. The barn had taken root not only in the soil, but in the minds of all who lived within reach of its shadow. There were attempts in those early years of the 21st century to make something of it. The land was valuable, not for farming, but for its story. Tourists wanted to come, ghost hunters, paranormal seekers, men and women with cameras and instruments who hoped to capture proof of what could not be explained. They came in droves, guided by the whispers of radio shows and the glowing screens of televisions that told the story of 22 families who had turned to dust, but not decay. They carried flashlights and recording machines. They stepped inside the barn with wide eyes and tight throats, and they left shaken, their voices quivering as they told of shadows that moved when no one stirred, of whispers that rose from the rafters when all had fallen silent. Some swore the air inside the barn grew thick, like syrup, pressing into their lungs until they stumbled back outside, gasping for breath. Others said they felt a hand brush against their shoulders, though no one stood near. A few left with photographs and recordings, but when shown in town, the images were always the same: blurred streaks, shapes, half-seen faces that could have been tricks of light, but could also have been the preserved dead watching from the gloom. Still, the barn remained beyond their reach. It could not be bought. It could not be sold. The county filed claims and surveys, but no deed was ever signed. Some said the paperwork vanished. Others claimed no lawyer would touch the case. Whatever the reason, the land lay unclaimed on paper, yet claimed by something far older. In truth, it became a place spoken of in guidebooks as though it were a museum. Though no sign marked the road and no ticket was ever sold, the barn was its own gatekeeper holding its silence with the same stubborn weight it had carried for nearly 2 centuries. For the people of Clayton County, the barn was more than a curiosity. It was a wound that never closed. Families still whispered the story around kitchen tables, still warned their children not to stray too far from the main roads. Some dismissed it as foolishness, but even they spoke softer when the wind blew from the east, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and hay. The older folk remembered how their parents and grandparents had told the story, how they had been warned never to go near the barn. They remembered the tales of sickness, sudden and merciless. They remembered the stories of neighbors who never came home. They remembered the number 22 families whole, an entire mothers, fathers, children, not one spared. 22, a number that carried the weight of truth. No matter how many times the world changed around it, the barn stood as a reminder of the cost of the frontier, of the way the land had demanded payment from those who sought to tame it. The Graysons had carved their home from wilderness, but the land had answered with silence, with bodies preserved against their will. It was a story, not of triumph, but of warning, and in its telling, one could hear the larger story of America itself. Of dreams met with loss, of hope swallowed by the unknown. The barn was a symbol of that truth, that progress was not always victory. That sometimes the land kept what it wanted, no matter how hard men worked or prayed or fought. On the last years of the century, historians came with pens and tape recorders. They interviewed the few who remembered the old homestead. They walked the barn themselves, though always with caution. They wrote of its weight in American memory, how it had become a symbol of the fragility of life on the edge of the frontier. They described how children who had never seen its walls still carried its story in their minds. How towns that had grown and changed still spoke of the barn as though it were a living neighbor. They wrote of how history was not always found in books or battles, but sometimes in the silence of a single place where the earth itself seemed to keep memory yet. Even as they wrote, even as they tried to tie the story to larger truths, none could explain the barn itself. The bodies still lay as they had for over a century, preserved without decay. Families who had lived and breathed and dreamed, now frozen in time, whole and unbroken. Their stillness was not peaceful, it was unnatural there. Silence was not rest, it was captivity, and those who looked upon them felt the same weight that had driven their ancestors to whisper, "This is not ours to understand him." So the barn remains to this day, standing tall against the horizon, weathered but unbroken, a monument not built by human hands but by time itself. Its doors still gape wide, its rafters still hold their silence, and within its shadow, the 22 families remain, a collection of the lost preserved, not for glory, but for warning. They are reminders that history is not always triumph, and that the land we walk upon holds secrets we may never name. Grayson Homestead is gone, the Grayson family scattered to the winds, but the barn endures. It endures in wood, and nail it endures in the whispers of those who tell its story. It endures in the silence of 22 families who never return to dust. And as long as the barn stands, as long as its shadow stretches across the fields, so too will the memory endure. For some stories are too heavy to be forgotten, and some places too strange to ever let go. Perhaps one day the barn will fall. Perhaps storms will finally take its roof, and winds will finally scatter its timbers. But even if that day comes, the story will not die. For the barn is no longer only wood and earth. It is memory, it is fear, it is history carved into the hearts of those who have lived in its shadow. It is Grayson's dark legacy, and as long as voices whisper across the American night, the story of the barn where 22 families turned to dust will live on, a story of silence, a story of mystery, a story of the past that will not release its hold.